In the summer of 1939, the world teetered on the edge of chaos. Germany, emboldened by broken treaties and weak opposition, prepared to strike Poland with a new form of warfare, Blitzkrieg. Secret deals were made in shadows, borders silently redrawn, and the stage was set for a conflict that would engulf nations, crush armies, and change the course of history forever. This is how the Second World War began. After the end of the First World War in 1918, Europe was left devastated. The war had caused enormous loss of life, destruction of infrastructure, and economic turmoil across the continent. Germany, as one of the Central Powers, bore the brunt of the blame for starting the conflict. In 1919, the victorious Allied powers, primarily Britain, France, and the United States, drafted and forced Germany to sign the Treaty of Versailles, a peace agreement intended to officially end the war and ensure that Germany could not pose a similar threat in the future. While the treaty was meant to establish lasting peace, its terms were extremely harsh and had far-reaching consequences for Germany and the rest of Europe. The Treaty of Versailles imposed several severe restrictions on Germany, both economically and militarily. Economically, Germany was required to pay huge reparations to the Allied countries to compensate for the damages caused during the war. These reparations placed an enormous strain on Germany's already weakened economy, which was further destabilized by post-war inflation and unemployment. The financial burden made it extremely difficult for Germany to recover, leading to widespread poverty, social unrest, and resentment among its population. Many Germans viewed these reparations as unjust, believing that they were being punished excessively for a war that had involved multiple nations. In addition to the economic demands, Germany also faced significant territorial losses. Large portions of German land were either taken away or placed under international supervision. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France, and other regions were given to Belgium, Denmark, and the newly created state of Poland. Furthermore, Germany's overseas colonies were confiscated and divided among the victorious Allied powers. This loss of territory was not only a blow to Germany's national pride, but also a major economic setback, as it reduced access to resources and strategic locations. The map of Europe was being redrawn in ways that left many Germans feeling humiliated and powerless. The military restrictions imposed by the treaty further fueled resentment. Germany was allowed only a small army of 100,000 men, a tiny navy, and no air force. The production and import of weapons were strictly controlled, and the country was forbidden from maintaining submarines or heavy artillery. These limitations were intended to prevent Germany from ever engaging in another large-scale conflict, but for many Germans they symbolized a loss of sovereignty and national strength. The once powerful German military, which had been a source of national pride, was reduced to a shadow of its former self. The combination of economic hardship, territorial loss, and military restrictions created an atmosphere of bitterness and anger throughout Germany. Many Germans felt that their country had been unfairly punished for the war and that the treaty had humiliated the nation in front of the world. This widespread dissatisfaction created fertile ground for extremist political movements. People were desperate for leaders who promised to restore Germany's pride, rebuild its economy, and overturn the humiliating terms of the treaty. It was in this environment of frustration and national humiliation that figures like Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to prominence, exploiting public anger to gain political support. In conclusion, the Treaty of Versailles, while intended to secure peace, instead left Germany politically, economically, and socially destabilized. The harsh reparations, loss of territory, and military restrictions not only humiliated the German people, but also set the stage for extremist ideologies to take root. This environment of resentment and desperation ultimately contributed to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the outbreak of the Second World War II decades later. The treaty's impact demonstrates how punitive measures, if not balanced with fairness and diplomacy, can sow the seeds of future conflict. After the devastation of the First World War, Germany was left politically unstable, economically weak, and socially humiliated. The Treaty of Versailles had placed enormous burdens on the country, including heavy reparations, territorial losses, and strict limitations on the military. Many Germans felt betrayed by their own government for accepting the treaty, a sentiment often referred to as the stab-in-the-back myth. In this environment of national humiliation and unrest, extremist political movements found fertile ground to gain support. Among these movements, the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, emerged as the most significant and dangerous, offering promises that appealed to the anger, fear, and aspirations of the German people. Adolf Hitler, a charismatic speaker and propagandist, promised to restore Germany's power and overturn the Treaty of Versailles. He portrayed the treaty as a deliberate humiliation imposed by foreign powers and blamed Germany's economic and political problems on weak politicians, communists, and Jews. Hitler's message resonated with many Germans who were struggling to survive amid the economic chaos of the 1920s and early 1930s. By presenting himself as a strong leader who could revive Germany's pride, rebuild its military, and reclaim lost territories, Hitler tapped into the sense of wounded national honor that had permeated German society since the end of World War I. The Nazi Party's rise was significantly aided by the severe economic hardship caused by the Great Depression, which began in 1929. Germany, already weakened by reparations and post-war economic instability, was particularly vulnerable to the global economic collapse. Millions of Germans lost their jobs, savings, and homes, creating widespread poverty and despair. People were desperate for solutions, and many were willing to support radical political parties that promised immediate action and relief. The Nazis capitalized on this desperation by promising jobs, social welfare, and economic revival, while simultaneously blaming Germany's problems on scapegoated groups, particularly Jews and communists. This combination of economic promises and nationalist rhetoric allowed the Nazi Party to gain a significant following among the middle class, industrial workers, and even some members of the elite who feared communist influence. Alongside economic factors, national pride and the desire for strong leadership played a major role in the Nazi Party's popularity. Many Germans were humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles and the perceived weakness of the Weimar Republic, Germany's democratic government established after World War I. The Republic was associated with political instability, frequent changes in government, and failure to effectively address economic crises. Hitler and the Nazis presented themselves as defenders of German honor, promising to restore the nation to its former glory and to create a society based on order, unity, and strength. Their emphasis on symbols, rallies, and propaganda further reinforced this sense of belonging and purpose among supporters, appealing to both emotions and national identity. In 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, marking a turning point in German history. Once in power, he moved quickly to consolidate control and dismantle the democratic institutions of the Weimar Republic. The Nazis passed laws that gave Hitler extraordinary powers, suppressed political opposition, and controlled the press and education system. Through the use of propaganda, secret police, and intimidation, Hitler built a totalitarian state in which the government had complete authority over nearly every aspect of public and private life. Political parties were banned, trade unions were dissolved, and dissent was ruthlessly punished. Hitler's vision of a centralized authoritarian regime enabled him to enforce Nazi ideology, including militarization, anti-Semitic policies, and aggressive foreign expansion, which would later set the stage for World War II. The combination of Hitler's promises, the Nazi Party's exploitation of economic hardship, and the appeal to national pride explains why millions of Germans supported him despite the radical nature of his agenda. People were willing to overlook the extreme measures proposed by the Nazis because they believed these actions were necessary to restore Germany's strength and dignity. Hitler's rise to power demonstrates how economic despair, political instability, and nationalistic sentiment can intersect to create conditions in which extremist leaders gain influence and establish authoritarian regimes. In conclusion, Hitler's promise to restore Germany's power, the popularity of the Nazi Party during economic hardship, and his appointment as Chancellor in 1933 all contributed to the establishment of a totalitarian state. The combination of economic collapse, humiliation from the Treaty of Versailles, and the appeal to national pride allowed Hitler to exploit public sentiment effectively. His rise highlights the dangers of political extremism in times of crisis and shows how a skilled propagandist can manipulate widespread fear and resentment to gain absolute power. Once in control, Hitler and the Nazis were able to reshape German society according to their ideology, leading to profound consequences not only for Germany but for the entire world. After the First World War, the victorious Allied powers had imposed strict conditions on the defeated nations, particularly Germany. Through the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty severely limited Germany's military capabilities, restricted its expansion, and imposed heavy economic reparations. However, by the mid-1930s, Germany began openly violating the treaty in ways that would alarm the international community and pave the way for further conflict. One of the most significant actions was the rebuilding of its military, which included the expansion of the army, the creation of a new air force, and the development of modern weapons. These efforts were a direct challenge to the Treaty of Versailles and demonstrated Germany's willingness to defy international agreements. In 1936, Germany took a particularly bold step by remilitarizing the Rhineland, a region that had been designated as a demilitarized zone under the treaty. German troops moved into the Rhineland without facing any significant opposition from France or Britain. This action not only violated the treaty but also sent a strong message that Germany was prepared to assert its dominance in Europe. The lack of response from the major powers of the time emboldened Hitler, reinforcing his belief that the Allies would avoid military confrontation no matter how aggressive Germany became. The remilitarization of the Rhineland was a key moment in the build-up to World War II because it undermined the authority of international agreements and revealed the weaknesses of the institutions designed to maintain peace. At the same time, other nations were also pursuing aggressive expansionist policies, further highlighting the instability of the international order. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, a small African nation, in an attempt to expand its colonial empire. Under the leadership of Benito Mussolini, Italy sought to demonstrate its strength and assert itself as a major power. The invasion was brutal, with Italian forces using modern weaponry, including chemical weapons, against Ethiopian soldiers and civilians. Despite widespread condemnation, the League of Nations, which had been established to prevent such acts of aggression, failed to take effective action. Economic sanctions were imposed, but they were limited and poorly enforced, allowing Italy to achieve its objectives. The invasion of Ethiopia revealed the League's inability to enforce its principles and protect smaller nations from powerful aggressors, undermining confidence in the organization. Meanwhile, in Asia, Japan invaded China in 1937, seeking to expand its territory and secure valuable resources. The invasion, often referred to as the Second Sino-Japanese War, was marked by extreme violence and atrocities committed against Chinese civilians and soldiers. Japan's expansion into China was driven by its need for raw materials, markets, and strategic advantage in East Asia. Despite the clear violation of international norms, the League of Nations again failed to take decisive action. The inability of the League to address Japanese aggression exposed its limitations on a global scale, further encouraging other nations to pursue their own ambitions without fear of meaningful consequences. These combined actions by Germany, Italy, and Japan illustrated a critical weakness in the international system of the 1930s. The League of Nations, established to prevent war and maintain global stability, had proven largely ineffective in responding to blatant acts of aggression. Its reliance on voluntary cooperation, lack of a standing military, and inconsistent enforcement of sanctions allowed aggressive nations to challenge international rules with little fear of reprisal. The failures of the League emboldened totalitarian leaders, convinced them that expansionist ambitions could be achieved without serious consequences, and ultimately destabilized the global order. By the late 1930s, it became increasingly clear that the world was moving toward another large-scale conflict. Germany's military buildup and remilitarization of the Rhineland, Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, and Japan's aggression in China demonstrated that aggressive powers were willing to ignore treaties, violate international norms, and pursue territorial expansion. These actions highlighted the fragility of peace in the interwar period and underscored the need for stronger mechanisms to prevent conflict. The inability of the League of Nations to enforce its principles or restrain aggressive nations showed that diplomatic agreements alone were insufficient to maintain global stability, creating conditions that would ultimately lead to the outbreak of the Second World War. In conclusion, the 1930s were marked by a series of aggressive actions by Germany, Italy, and Japan, which collectively revealed the weaknesses of international organizations like the League of Nations. Germany violated the Treaty of Versailles by rebuilding its military and remilitarizing the Rhineland. Italy invaded Ethiopia to expand its empire, and Japan attacked China in pursuit of resources and territory. The failure of the League to respond effectively to these violations exposed its limitations and demonstrated that aggressive powers could act with impunity. These developments not only emboldened the Axis powers but also set the stage for the global conflict that would erupt in 1939. In the years leading up to the Second World War, Germany, under Adolf Hitler, pursued an aggressive foreign policy aimed at expanding its territory and overturning the post-World War I settlement. One of the first major steps in this expansionist agenda was the annexation of Austria, known as the Anschluss, in 1938. Austria, Germany's neighbor to the south, shared a common language and cultural heritage with Germany, and Hitler used this connection to justify the union of the two countries. Many Austrians welcomed the idea of unification with Germany, while others were intimidated or coerced into compliance through political pressure and the presence of German troops. On March 12, 1938, German forces crossed the Austrian border, and the Anschluss was effectively complete within a day. The international community, preoccupied with other issues and unwilling to confront Hitler militarily, largely failed to respond decisively. This lack of resistance sent a strong signal that Germany could pursue territorial ambitions without immediate consequences. Following the Anschluss, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, a region along the border with Germany that was home to a significant ethnic German population. Hitler claimed that the German-speaking inhabitants of the Sudetenland were being mistreated and used this as a pretext to demand the region's annexation. The Sudetenland was strategically important, containing mountain defenses that protected the heart of Czechoslovakia, as well as industrial resources crucial to its economy. Hitler's demands created a tense situation in Europe, raising fears of a broader conflict as Czechoslovakia resisted German pressure. Instead of confronting Hitler directly, Britain and France adopted a policy of appeasement, hoping to avoid war by granting him the territories he demanded. Appeasement was based on the belief that satisfying Hitler's limited territorial ambitions would maintain peace and prevent another catastrophic conflict like World War I. The British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain became the chief proponent of this approach, famously declaring that he had secured peace for our time. After signing agreements that allowed Germany to take the Sudetenland, France, allied with Czechoslovakia, also agreed to the terms under diplomatic pressure, fearing that resistance without British support could lead to a disastrous military confrontation. The policy of appeasement, while intended to preserve peace, had unintended consequences. Rather than containing Hitler, it encouraged him to push further, reinforcing his belief that the Western powers lacked the resolve to oppose him militarily. The annexation of Austria and the cession of the Sudetenland were achieved without any significant resistance, which emboldened Hitler to plan even more aggressive moves. He interpreted the willingness of Britain and France to concede these territories as evidence that they would continue to avoid confrontation, allowing him to pursue his broader ambitions of dominating Central Europe and ultimately challenging the international order. The Sudetenland crisis culminated in the Munich Agreement of September 1938, where Britain, France, Germany, and Italy met to settle the issue without consulting Czechoslovakia, the country most affected by the decision. Czechoslovakia was forced to cede the Sudetenland to Germany under the terms of the agreement, losing both strategic defenses and economic resources. The decision was widely criticized at the time and is often cited by historians as a key example of the dangers of appeasement. While it temporarily avoided armed conflict, it failed to address the underlying threat posed by Hitler's expansionist ambitions and left the region vulnerable to further aggression. Hitler's successful annexation of Austria and acquisition of the Sudetenland demonstrated the failure of collective security in Europe. The League of Nations, already weakened by previous acts of aggression in the 1930s, had no meaningful role in preventing Germany's actions. Britain and France's reluctance to intervene militarily allowed Hitler to consolidate power and plan subsequent invasions, including the complete occupation of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, which went beyond the territorial claims of the Sudetenland. This action exposed the emptiness of appeasement as a policy and signaled to the world that Hitler's ambitions were not limited to reuniting ethnic Germans or correcting the perceived injustices of the Treaty of Versailles. The policy of appeasement also had broader implications for international politics. By allowing Hitler to achieve his objectives without resistance, Britain and France undermined their credibility as defenders of smaller nations and democratic principles. This created an environment in which aggressive leaders elsewhere, such as Mussolini in Italy and militarists in Japan, were emboldened to pursue their own expansionist goals, believing that the major powers would again avoid confrontation. The lack of immediate consequences for Hitler's actions destabilized Europe further, setting the stage for the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. In conclusion, Germany's annexation of Austria and the takeover of the Sudetenland were critical steps in Hitler's path toward global conflict. The policy of appeasement by Britain and France intended to prevent war, inadvertently encouraged Hitler to continue his aggressive expansion, believing that the Allies would not intervene militarily. These events highlighted the weaknesses of international diplomacy at the time and exposed the dangers of conceding to authoritarian leaders in the hope of maintaining peace. The failure to confront Germany's early violations of post-World War I agreements ultimately contributed to the conditions that made the Second World War inevitable, demonstrating that appeasement, while well-intentioned, can have profoundly destabilizing consequences when dealing with aggressive and ideologically driven leaders. In the late 1930s, Europe was on the brink of another major conflict. Hitler's Germany had already annexed Austria in the Anschluss of 1938 and seized the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, while Britain and France had pursued a policy of appeasement, allowing him to expand without military resistance. As 1939 approached, Hitler was planning his next major move, the invasion of Poland. However, he faced a significant strategic problem. Germany shared a long eastern border with the Soviet Union, and any attack on Poland could provoke Soviet intervention. To ensure that he could act without fear of a two-front war, Hitler sought a diplomatic agreement with Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. In August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, also known as the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. On the surface, the agreement was a promise that neither country would attack the other or support third-party attacks against each other. This public aspect of the pact was intended to reassure the world that Germany and the Soviet Union were entering a period of peaceful coexistence, at least temporarily. The agreement shocked many observers, as Germany and the Soviet Union had been ideologically opposed. Nazism and communism were bitter enemies, each seeking to expand its own influence. Yet, despite their ideological differences, both leaders saw strategic benefits in cooperation at that moment. Beneath the public declaration, the pact contained secret protocols that had even more significant implications for Europe. These protocols included a detailed plan to divide Poland between Germany and the Soviet Union, effectively erasing the country from the map. The eastern portion of Poland would fall under Soviet control, while the western portion would be annexed by Germany. In addition to Poland, the secret agreement outlines spheres of influence in other regions, including the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which were to fall under Soviet influence. These secret arrangements demonstrated that the pact was not a genuine effort to maintain peace, but rather a tactical move by both nations to advance their territorial ambitions, while avoiding immediate conflict with each other. The signing of the Nazi-Soviet Pact had immediate and far-reaching consequences. For Hitler, it cleared the way for the invasion of Poland without fear of Soviet opposition. This was critical for his military strategy, as Germany had learned from World War I that fighting on two fronts simultaneously could be disastrous. With the Soviet Union effectively neutralized as a potential adversary, Hitler was free to concentrate his military forces on the rapid conquest of Poland. This led to the development of the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war strategy, which relied on fast-moving, coordinated attacks by tanks, aircraft, and infantry to quickly overwhelm enemy defenses. The non-aggression pact gave Hitler the confidence that he could execute this plan without immediate strategic complications from the east. The pact also had significant political and psychological effects. Many European nations were shocked and alarmed by the agreement between two seemingly incompatible powers. Britain and France, already concerned about Hitler's expansionist ambitions, now faced the prospect of a powerful alliance between Germany and the Soviet Union, which could destabilize the entire continent. The pact undermined trust in diplomatic negotiations and demonstrated that Hitler was willing to use any means, including temporary alliances with ideological enemies, to achieve his objectives. For the Soviet Union, the agreement provided a buffer zone and time to prepare militarily, as Stalin sought to strengthen Soviet defenses in anticipation of eventual conflict with Germany, which he likely recognized as inevitable. On 1 September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, marking the official start of the Second World War. German forces rapidly advanced using Blitzkrieg tactics, overwhelming Polish defenses and occupying large portions of the country within weeks. 2 weeks later, on 17 September, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, in accordance with the secret protocols of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Poland was quickly divided and annexed by the two powers, demonstrating the brutal effectiveness of their agreement. The invasion triggered Britain and France to declare war on Germany on 30 September 1939, honoring their commitments to defend Polish sovereignty. Despite these declarations, the rapid fall of Poland highlighted the failure of appeasement and the dangers posed by secret pacts and alliances among aggressive powers. The Nazi-Soviet Pact ultimately reshaped the strategic landscape of Europe. It allowed Germany to expand westward without fear of Soviet interference, provided Stalin with territorial gains in the east, and temporarily altered the balance of power on the continent. The agreement also highlighted the cynical nature of diplomacy in the late 1930s, as ideological differences were set aside for opportunistic gain. While the pact provided short-term security for both leaders, it was ultimately temporary. Hitler would later break the agreement by invading the Soviet Union in 1941, demonstrating that the pact was merely a tactical measure rather than a lasting alliance. In conclusion, the signing of the Non-Aggression Pact between Germany and the Soviet Union in August 1939, along with the secret agreement to divide Poland, was a decisive moment in the lead-up to the Second World War. It enabled Germany to invade Poland without fear of Soviet intervention, set the stage for the rapid escalation of global conflict, and revealed the fragile nature of peace and diplomacy in Europe. The pact illustrated how strategic alliances could be used as tools for aggression, ultimately contributing to the outbreak of one of the deadliest wars in human history. By the late 1930s, Europe was on edge. Hitler's Germany had already annexed Austria and the Anschluss of 1938 and seized the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. While Britain and France had repeatedly tried to avoid conflict through appeasement, the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of August 1939, which included a secret agreement to divide Poland, cleared the way for Germany to pursue further aggression without fear of a two-front war. With diplomatic obstacles removed, Germany turned its attention to Poland, aiming to expand its territory and achieve strategic dominance in Central Europe. The invasion of Poland would not only serve Hitler's long-term expansionist ambitions, but also test the response of Britain and France, the European powers committed to defending Polish sovereignty. On 1 September 1939, Germany launched its invasion of Poland, initiating a military strategy known as Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. Blitzkrieg represented a dramatic shift in modern warfare, relying on speed, coordination, and surprise to overwhelm opponents before they could mount an effective defense. Unlike the static trench warfare of World War I, Blitzkrieg emphasized rapid, combined attacks using tanks, mechanized infantry, and air power to penetrate deep into enemy territory. German forces bombed key infrastructure, communication centers, and military positions from the air, while ground forces advanced swiftly, encircling and isolating Polish units. The tactic aimed to create confusion and panic, prevent organized resistance, and allow German forces to achieve rapid territorial gains. Blitzkrieg proved highly effective against Poland, whose military, though brave, was not equipped to withstand the speed and coordination of the German assault. The invasion of Poland was both strategic and symbolic. Strategically, Poland's location made it critical for Germany's plans for further expansion in Europe. By controlling Poland, Germany could secure its eastern flank and access resources necessary for its military campaigns. Symbolically, the invasion was a demonstration of Hitler's willingness to defy international agreements and assert German power by force. Poland had long been the focus of Hitler's expansionist ideology, as outlined in his plan for Lebensraum, or living space, which sought to provide territory for the growing German population. The invasion was thus a combination of practical military objectives and ideological ambition, reflecting the broader goals of Nazi Germany in the years leading up to World War II. Despite Germany's rapid success, the invasion triggered the commitments of Britain and France, who had pledged to defend Poland's independence. On 3 September 1939, just 2 days after the German attack, both countries declared war on Germany. This marked the official beginning of the Second World War in Europe, transforming what had been a regional conflict into a global struggle. Britain and France mobilized their militaries, preparing for a war they had long hoped to avoid. The declarations of war were significant not only as a legal and political response, but also as a signal to the world that Germany's aggressive expansion would no longer go unchecked, at least in principle. However, at the onset of the conflict, the Allied response on the ground was limited, and Germany's Blitzkrieg tactics allowed it to make significant gains before a full-scale Allied counterattack could be organized. The invasion of Poland also highlighted several key lessons about modern warfare and international relations. First, it demonstrated the effectiveness of mechanized, combined arms tactics, which would become a hallmark of German military operations in the early years of the war. Blitzkrieg allowed Germany to achieve rapid territorial gains, destroy infrastructure, and demoralize opponents in a way that traditional military strategies could not. Second, it revealed the weaknesses of European diplomatic efforts to prevent conflict. Despite warnings and agreements, Hitler had been able to pursue his ambitions unchecked, exploiting the failures of appeasement and the limitations of the League of Nations. Finally, the invasion underscored the importance of alliances and commitments in international politics, as Britain and France were compelled to act based on their obligations to smaller nations, setting the stage for a wider war. The consequences of Germany's invasion were immediate and far-reaching. Polish forces were quickly overwhelmed, and by early October 1939, the country had been divided between Germany and the Soviet Union in accordance with the secret protocols of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. The occupation brought widespread suffering to the Polish population, including mass arrests, executions, and the persecution of political, intellectual, and ethnic groups. For Europe as a whole, the invasion marked the failure of diplomatic efforts to contain Hitler through negotiation and appeasement. It also signaled that any future attempts to resist German aggression would require mobilization on a scale that many countries were not yet prepared to undertake. In conclusion, the German invasion of Poland using Blitzkrieg tactics on 1 September 1939, followed by the declarations of war from Britain and France on 30 September, officially marked the beginning of the Second World War. The speed and efficiency of the German military demonstrated the effectiveness of modern mechanized warfare, while the Allied response highlighted the political and strategic challenges of confronting a determined and aggressive power. The events in Poland set the stage for a global conflict that would engulf Europe and the world, showing both the dangers of unchecked aggression and the devastating consequences of modern warfare in the 20th century. The invasion of Poland was not only a military campaign, but also a turning point that signaled the collapse of peace in Europe and the start of one of the deadliest conflicts in human history.